The dust-laden wind carried the sound of a baby's cry across the desolate plains, stopping Dawson Reed in his tracks as he rode past the abandoned church on the outskirts of Silverdale, Colorado. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild enough that unexpected sounds in deserted places meant trouble, opportunity, or both. Dawson pulled back on the reins of his chestnut mare, Penny, and listened. The crying continued, high and desperate, coming from the dilapidated wooden structure that had once served as the town's first church before a newer one was built closer to the growing settlement. Most folks avoided the old building, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of those who died in the smallpox epidemic that had swept through 5 years prior. But Dawson Reed wasn't most folks. At 32, he'd seen enough real horrors in his life that ghost stories didn't spook him. He dismounted, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the hard, packed earth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as he approached the church, his hand resting instinctively on the Colt revolver at his hip. As he rounded the corner to the front steps, he froze. A young woman sat on the weathered boards, cradling a squalling infant to her chest. Her dress was travel-worn but of good quality, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her face as she bent over the child. She looked up at his approach, eyes widening with alarm. "I mean no harm, madam," Dawson said quickly, raising his hands to show they were empty. Heard the little one crying. The woman clutched the baby tighter. "We're just resting," she said, her voice cultured but trembling with exhaustion. "We'll be moving on shortly." Dawson took in the scene with a practiced eye, no horse or wagon in sight. The woman's boots were caked with mud and her skin was sunburnt across her cheeks and nose. She'd been walking, and for some distance. "I'm Dawson Reed," he said simply. "Got a ranch about 5 miles east of here." He gestured to the baby. "That little one sounds hungry." The woman hesitated, then lifted her chin proudly. "My name is Margaret Thornton, and yes, she is hungry. I haven't been able to feed her properly since yesterday." Dawson noticed the woman's hands trembling as she adjusted the blanket around the infant. He'd seen that look before desperation mingled with fierce determination. "Miss Thornton, I don't mean to pry, but it'll be dark soon. This isn't a safe place to spend the night." "There's a town just 2 miles north." "I can't go to the town," she interrupted, something like fear flashing in her eyes. Dawson studied her for a moment. Running from something or someone, that much was clear. He'd seen his share of folks with secrets in his years of ranching in Colorado territory. Sometimes those secrets were worth respecting. "Then let me help you," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "I can offer you and your baby shelter for the night, food, clean water." No questions asked. Margaret's gaze darted over him, assessing. The baby's cries grew more insistent. "Why would you help strangers?" she asked, suspicion evident in her tone. Dawson replaced his hat and looked toward the horizon. "Because 12 years ago, I was riding through a storm with nowhere to go, and a family took me in without asking who I was or what I'd done. Sometimes a person just needs a hand." He paused. "I give you my word, no harm will come to you or your child." The baby wailed louder, tiny fists waving in the air. Margaret looked down at her daughter, then back at Dawson. He could see the internal struggle playing across her features. "I can't pay you," she finally said. "I'm not asking for payment, madam." Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly. "Just for tonight, then," Dawson nodded, relieved she'd accepted. "My horse can carry us both back to the ranch. She's strong and steady." As he helped Margaret to her feet, he noticed she swayed slightly. When was the last time she'd eaten? He didn't ask, simply steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "What's the little one's name?" he asked as they walked toward Penny. Margaret looked down at the infant, who had momentarily quieted. "Grace," she whispered. "Her name is Grace." Dawson helped Margaret onto Penny's back before mounting behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance while ensuring she and the baby wouldn't fall. As they rode toward his ranch, the setting sun painted the vast Colorado sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a beautiful end to a day that had taken an unexpected turn. What Dawson couldn't know then was that finding Margaret Thornton feeding her baby on the steps of that abandoned church would change the course of his life forever. The ride to Dawson's ranch, took nearly an hour with the extra weight on Penny's back. They traveled mostly in silence, the baby having cried herself to sleep against Margaret's chest. As they crested the final hill, Dawson's property came into view, a modest but well-maintained ranch house with a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings nestled in a protected valley. "Welcome to Willow Creek Ranch," Dawson said, nodding toward the homestead below. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." Margaret took in the scene with tired eyes. "It looks lovely," she said softly, and Dawson felt an unexpected swell of pride at her words. As they approached the house, a tall, lanky man emerged from the barn. "That's Frank Holloway," Dawson explained. "My ranch hand. Good man, been with me 5 years now." Frank squinted up at them, surprise evident on his weathered face as he noticed Margaret and the baby. "Evening, boss," he called, approaching cautiously. "Didn't expect company." "Frank, this is Miss Thornton and her daughter Grace. They'll be staying with us tonight," Dawson said, dismounting before reaching up to help Margaret down. "Could you see to Penny? She's had a long day." "Of course," Frank agreed, though his curious gaze lingered on Margaret. To his credit, he asked no questions, simply took the reins and led the horse toward the barn. Dawson guided Margaret toward the 2-story ranch house. It was built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. "Let's get you both inside and comfortable." Once inside, Margaret glanced around the main room. It was simple but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable-looking furniture arranged before it. A dining table stood near windows that overlooked the valley, and a kitchen area occupied the back of the house. "Please sit," Dawson gestured to a chair at the table. "I'll get a fire going and put on some coffee. Are you hungry?" Margaret nodded, sinking gratefully into the chair. "Yes, very." "Thank you." As Dawson busied himself with the fire and food preparation, Margaret gently rocked Grace, who had begun to stir again. The baby's whimpers quickly turned to full-throated cries. "There's fresh milk in the springhouse," Dawson said, turning from the stove. "Would that help?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke quietly. I can feed her myself, but I haven't had enough to eat to produce what she needs." Understanding dawned on Dawson's face, and he nodded without embarrassment. "I'll bring you some food right away. There's a bedroom just through that door if you'd like privacy." Gratitude washed over Margaret's features. "Thank you." While Margaret fed Grace in the bedroom, Dawson prepared a simple but hearty meal: beans, bacon, and fresh biscuits he'd made that morning. He placed a generous portion on a plate, along with a cup of hot coffee sweetened with a little sugar, and knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Miss Thornton, food's ready whenever you are." A moment later, Margaret emerged, Grace nestled contentedly in her arms. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny mouth working in sleep. "She seems happier," Dawson observed, pulling out a chair for Margaret at the table. "She's still hungry, but she'll sleep for a little while now," Margaret said, settling Grace in one arm while she reached for a fork with her free hand. Dawson watched as she ate quickly, barely pausing between bites. He didn't speak, giving her space to satisfy her hunger. When she'd finished, color had returned to her cheeks. "That was wonderful," Margaret said, sounding almost surprised. "You're quite the cook, Mr. Reed." "Dawson, please," he corrected with a small smile. "And when you've been on your own as long as I have, you learn to feed yourself properly or suffer the consequences." Margaret studied him. "No wife, family?" "No, madam, just me and Frank and the animals." He poured her more coffee. "If you don't mind my asking, where were you headed when I found you today?" Margaret's expression closed slightly. "West," she said simply. "As far west as I can go." Dawson nodded, respecting her reluctance to elaborate. "Well, you're welcome to rest here for as long as you need. I've got the space, and frankly, it's nice having someone besides Frank to talk to." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "That's very generous, but I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," Dawson interrupted gently. "Winter's coming soon. It's no time to be traveling with a little one, especially on foot." Margaret glanced down at Grace, and Dawson could see the worry in her eyes. "I don't know you, Mr. Reed Dawson," she said carefully. "No, you don't," he agreed, "but I give you my word that you'll be safe here. The ranch is remote enough that few visitors come calling, and those who do mind their own business." He paused. "Whatever you're running from, it won't find you here." Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "I never said I was running," Dawson gave her a knowing look. You didn't have to. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and Grace's soft breathing. 3 days, Margaret finally said. We'll stay 3 days to regain our strength, then we need to move on. Dawson nodded, though something in him wanted to argue for longer. 3 days it is. Now you should get some rest. You can have my room upstairs, clean sheets on the bed, I'll take the sofa. Margaret looked ready to protest, but exhaustion won out. Thank you, Dawson, for everything. As he showed her upstairs to his bedroom, Dawson felt a strange protectiveness toward this woman and her child, strangers who had appeared in his life just hours ago. He couldn't explain it, but somehow, their presence made his house feel more like a home than it had in years. That night, as Dawson lay on the sofa staring at the ceiling, he wondered what circumstances had driven Margaret Thornton to that abandoned church, alone with an infant and clearly desperate. Whatever her story, he had meant what he said: she would be safe at Willow Creek Ranch for as long as she chose to stay. The next morning, Dawson woke before dawn, as was his habit. He moved quietly around the kitchen, brewing coffee and preparing breakfast, mindful of his sleeping guests upstairs. Frank arrived as the sun was rising, stamping his boots on the porch before entering. "Morning, boss," he said, keeping his voice low. "Our guests still sleeping?" Dawson nodded, handing him a cup of coffee. "Let them rest. They've had a hard journey, I reckon." Frank accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Where'd you find them anyway? Not exactly common to see a woman and baby out here alone." "At the old church," Dawson replied, cracking eggs into a pan. "She was feeding the baby on the steps, no horse, no supplies to speak of." Frank whistled low. "Running from something, I'd wager. Seems likely." Dawson turned to face his ranch hand. "Frank, whatever her story is, it's hers to tell or keep. While she's here, she's under my protection. Understand?" "Course I do," Frank said, looking slightly offended. "You know me better than that, Dawson." Dawson clapped him on the shoulder. "I do, just making things clear." He glanced toward the stairs. "Now, what's on the agenda today?" They discussed ranch business fences needing repair, cattle to be moved to the lower pasture, preparations for the coming winter, when the creak of floorboards overhead signaled that Margaret was awake. A few minutes later, she descended the stairs with Grace in her arms. She had tidied her hair and washed her face, and despite the same travel-worn dress, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Good morning," she said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. Frank stood immediately, removing his hat. "Madam," he said with a respectful nod. "Miss Thornton, this is Frank Holloway," Dawson said formally. "Frank, Miss Margaret Thornton, and her daughter Grace." "Pleased to meet you properly, madam," Frank said. "Sweet little one you've got there." A hint of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." "Just Frank, madam." "Everyone calls me Frank." "Breakfast is almost ready," Dawson said, gesturing to the table. "Please sit." After a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy, Frank headed out to start the day's work. Dawson lingered at the table, watching as Margaret gently rocked Grace. "I have some things to attend to around the ranch," he said, "but please make yourself at home. There's a wash tub out back if you'd like to freshen up, and I'm sure I can find some clean clothes that might fit you." Margaret looked down at her dress and nodded gratefully. "That would be wonderful. And perhaps, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, might I wash my dress and Grace's things? They could use a good cleaning." "Of course," Dawson said. He rose and went to a trunk in the corner of the room, pulling out a simple blue dress. "This belonged to my sister. She left it here last time she visited. It might be a bit large, but it should do while your clothes dry." Margaret accepted the dress, her fingers brushing against the fabric. "Your sister visits often?" "No," Dawson said, a shadow crossing his face. "Not anymore. She lives in St. Louis now with her husband. It's been 2 years since she was here." Margaret seemed to sense the change in his mood. "I'm sorry, it must be difficult being so far from family," Dawson shrugged. "It's the life I chose." He moved toward the door. "I'll heat some water for your bath and bring it out back. Take your time, there's no rush." While Margaret bathed and washed clothes, Dawson kept himself busy with chores close to the house, occasionally checking that she had everything she needed without intruding on her privacy. By midday, she was sitting on the porch in his sister's blue dress. her hair damp and shining in the sun as she watched Grace sleep in a makeshift cradle Dawson had quickly assembled from a wooden crate and some blankets. "This is a beautiful place," Margaret said as Dawson joined her on the porch with 2 glasses of water. "So peaceful." "That's why I chose it," Dawson replied, sitting in the chair beside her. "After the war, I needed space and quiet." Margaret glanced at him. "You fought in the war between the states," Dawson nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Union Army. Enlisted in '63, fought till the end. You were very young. 18 when I joined up. Old enough to kill, too young to understand what it would cost me." He sipped his water, surprised at himself for sharing something he rarely discussed. "Afterward, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts. So I came west, worked cattle drives for a few years, then saved enough to buy this place." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching him. "And you've been here alone all this time?" "Not alone. Had a partner at first, but he took off for the gold fields in '73. Frank came along after that, and I've got neighbors, though they're miles away." He turned to look at her. "What about you, Miss Thornton? Where are you from?" She hesitated, then seemed to decide that fair exchange deserved some truth. "Boston, originally. My father was a merchant, textiles." Margaret's fingers tightened around her glass. "He disowned me when I refused to marry the man he chose. My mother died years ago, and I have no siblings." She glanced down at Grace. "When I found myself with child and unmarried, I had nowhere to go." Dawson absorbed this information without judgment. "And Grace's father?" A bitter smile crossed Margaret's face. "He made promises he had no intention of keeping. When I told him about the baby, he denied responsibility and disappeared." She touched Grace's cheek gently. "I managed on my own for a while in Denver, working as a seamstress, but then I saw him again with his new wife. He threatened to take Grace away, to claim I was unfit, said his wife couldn't have children and they would raise her as their own." Understanding dawned on Dawson. "So you ran?" Margaret nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "He has money, connections. I couldn't fight him in the courts. So I took what little I had and left in the night. We were doing fine until our stagecoach was robbed 3 days ago. The bandits took everything, my money, my bag with our clothes and supplies. The driver was killed and the other passengers scattered. Grace and I walked until we reached that church." Dawson felt anger rise within him at the thought of Margaret and Grace alone and vulnerable on the dangerous roads. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "No one will harm you here." Margaret looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Why are you doing this, Dawson?" "Taking in strangers, offering protection. You know nothing about me." Dawson considered her question carefully. "I know you're a mother protecting her child. I know you've endured hardship with courage. That tells me enough about your character." He paused. "And perhaps I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of recognition. In that moment, Dawson knew that 3 days would not be enough. Not nearly enough. The rest of the day passed peacefully. Margaret helped prepare dinner, proving herself quite skilled in the kitchen despite her refined upbringing. After the meal, they sat by the fire while Frank entertained them with tales of his adventures before coming to Willow Creek Ranch. "So there I was," Frank said, gesturing broadly. "Face to face with the biggest grizzly I'd ever seen, no gun, just my knife, when a sudden pounding on the door interrupted his story." Dawson rose immediately, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Margaret clutched Grace to her chest, fear evident in her eyes. "Stay here," Dawson said quietly, moving to the door. He opened it cautiously to find Sheriff Tom Barlow standing on his porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Dawson," the sheriff said, his expression grim. "Sorry to disturb you so late." "Tom," Dawson acknowledged, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff entered, nodding respectfully to Margaret and Frank. His eyes lingered on Margaret and the baby with obvious curiosity. "Got reports of bandits operating in the area," Sheriff Barlow said, returning his attention to Dawson. "Hit a stagecoach 3 days back, killed the driver, been robbing travelers on the Denver road." He glanced again at Margaret. "Evening, madam," Dawson made the introductions smoothly. "Sheriff, this is Miss Margaret Thornton, a friend visiting from back east, and her daughter Grace." Margaret, Sheriff Tom Barlow from Silverdale. Margaret nodded politely, though Dawson could see the tension in her shoulders. "Miss Thornton," the sheriff said, tipping his head. "Forgive the intrusion, just warning folks to be careful. These bandits are dangerous men." "We appreciate the warning," Dawson said. "Coffee, Tom?" "No thanks, need to make a few more stops tonight." The sheriff hesitated. "Actually, there was something else. Got a telegram from Denver. Man there is looking for his wife and child, says she ran off with their baby. Described a woman matching." He glanced uncomfortably at Margaret. Dawson felt rather than saw Margaret stiffen. "That's so," Dawson said calmly. "Well, Miss Thornton here is my sister's friend from Boston. She's been staying with us for nearly 2 weeks now, hasn't she, Frank?" Frank didn't miss a beat. "Yes, sir, came on the eastbound stage. Been a pleasure having her and little Grace brighten up the place." Sheriff Barlow looked between them, clearly uncertain. "I see. Well, if you happen to see or hear anything about a young woman traveling alone with an infant, I'd appreciate knowing." "Of course," Dawson agreed. "I'll ride into town if we hear anything." After the sheriff left, Margaret turned to Dawson and Frank, her face pale. "You lied for me. You could get in trouble." "I didn't lie," Dawson said evenly. "I called you a friend, and that's the truth. As for how long you've been here, well, time is relative, isn't it?" Frank chuckled. "Boss has a way with words when he needs to." He stood and reached for his hat. "I'd best get back to my cabin. Sleep well, folks." After Frank departed, Margaret sat trembling by the fire. "He's found me already," she whispered. "How could he have tracked me so quickly?" Dawson sat beside her. "A man like that, with money and influence, it wouldn't be hard to send telegrams to every sheriff's office within 100 miles. "I have to leave," Margaret said desperately. "Tonight, if they find me here, you'll be arrested for helping me." "No," Dawson said firmly. "Running now would be the worst thing you could do. Sheriff Barlow is watching the roads. If he sees you traveling alone with Grace, he'll have to bring you in." He took her hand impulsively. "Margaret, listen to me. Stay here, let me help you." "How?" she asked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He'll never stop looking." Dawson took a deep breath, the idea that had been forming in his mind since the sheriff's visit now crystallizing into certainty. "Marry me," he said simply. Margaret stared at him, shock replacing her tears. "What? Marry me," Dawson repeated. "If you're my wife, Grace becomes my daughter in the eyes of the law. He'd have no claim on her." But we barely know each other," Margaret stammered. "I know enough," Dawson said softly. "I know you're brave and strong. I know you love your daughter more than anything. And I know that in the short time you've been here, this house has felt more like a home than it ever has." Margaret searched his face. "You would do that? Tie yourself to a woman you just met, take on another man's child?" "It wouldn't be a hardship," Dawson said, surprising himself with the truth of his words. "And it doesn't have to be forever. Once the danger has passed, if you wish to leave, I won't stop you. But right now, this is the best protection I can offer you both." Margaret looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the danger threatening their fragile security. When she looked up again, determination had replaced fear in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I accept your offer, Dawson Reed." The following morning, Dawson rode into Silverdale with Frank, leaving Margaret and Grace safely at the ranch. They headed straight to the small church where Reverend Miller was sweeping the steps. "Dawson, Frank," the Reverend greeted them. "Don't often see you boys in town this early." "Morning, Reverend," Dawson replied. "I was hoping to speak with you about performing a marriage ceremony." The Reverend's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "A marriage for whom?" "For me," Dawson said. "I'd like you to marry me and Miss Margaret Thornton tomorrow, if possible." Reverend Miller leaned on his broom, studying Dawson's face. "Margaret Thornton, don't believe I've had the pleasure. She's staying at my ranch," Dawson explained. "She's from back east, friend of my sister's." "I see," the Reverend said slowly, "and this is a hasty arrangement." Dawson understood the implication. "It's not what you're thinking, Reverend. Miss Thornton is a respectable woman. She was recently widowed and has a young daughter. They need stability, and I'm in a position to provide it." The partial truth came easily to Dawson's lips. He decided on the journey to town that a widow's story would raise fewer questions than that of an unmarried mother. The Reverend seemed to accept this explanation. "Very well, tomorrow at noon." "That would be perfect," Dawson agreed. "Thank you, Reverend." Their next stop was the general store, where Dawson purchased fabric for a new dress for Margaret, along with supplies for the baby and a simple gold band from the jewelry case. As they were loading their purchases onto their horses, Sheriff Barlow approached from across the street. "Morning, Dawson, Frank," he said, eyeing their packages. "Doing some shopping." "Morning, Sheriff," Dawson replied easily. "Just picking up a few things. Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. I've got some news. I'm getting married tomorrow." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "Married to whom?" "Miss Thornton," Dawson said. "Been courting her through letters for nearly a year now, ever since my sister introduced us. She came west to see if she'd like ranch life, and we decided there's no point in waiting." Sheriff Barlow looked skeptical. "That's mighty sudden, Dawson." "When you know," Dawson said with a shrug. "You and Mrs. Barlow are welcome to attend, noon tomorrow at the church." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, congratulations then. I'll see if the missus can make it." He tipped his hat and continued down the street, glancing back once with a thoughtful expression. "He's suspicious," Frank muttered as they mounted up. "Let him be," Dawson replied. "After tomorrow, Margaret and Grace will be legally under my protection. That's all that matters." When they returned to the ranch, Dawson presented Margaret with the fabric and other items. Her eyes filled with tears as she fingered the soft blue calico. "You shouldn't have spent your money on me," she said quietly. "What kind of husband would I be if I didn't provide for my wife?" Dawson asked with a gentle smile. "Besides, every bride deserves a new dress." Margaret worked through the afternoon and evening, skillfully cutting and stitching the fabric into a simple but lovely dress. Dawson watched her nimble fingers work the needle and thread, amazed at her concentration and skill. "You're quite good at that," he observed as she attached the bodice to the skirt. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I told you I worked as a seamstress in Denver. I always had a knack for it, even as a girl. My mother taught me before she died." "Tell me about her," Dawson said, settling into a chair across from her. Margaret's hands stilled for a moment. "She was beautiful, kind. She loved music. She played the piano every evening after dinner." A shadow crossed her face. "She became ill when I was 14, consumption. It took her quickly." "I'm sorry," Dawson said. "My mother passed when I was young too, fever." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of fabric as Margaret resumed her sewing. "Are you certain about tomorrow?" she asked without looking up. "It's not too late to change your mind." "I'm certain," Dawson replied without hesitation. "Are you?" Margaret met his gaze then. "Yes," she said softly. I wish it could be real." Something shifted in Dawson's chest at her words. "Who says it can't be?" he asked, his voice low. "Maybe not now, but someday. We could give it a chance." A blush colored Margaret's cheeks, and she looked back down at her sewing. "Perhaps," she said, almost too quietly to hear. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect October day. Frank arrived early, dressed in his Sunday best, to drive them to town in the wagon. Margaret looked radiant in her new blue dress, her hair arranged simply but elegantly. Grace was wrapped in a clean blanket, contentedly sleeping in her mother's arms. "You look beautiful," Dawson said as he helped Margaret into the wagon. "Thank you," she replied, a hint of shyness in her voice. "You look quite handsome yourself." Dawson smoothed his freshly trimmed beard self-consciously. He'd taken extra care with his appearance, wearing his best black suit and a new white shirt he'd been saving for a special occasion. The small church was nearly empty when they arrived, just Reverend Miller waiting at the altar and, to Dawson's surprise, Sheriff and Mrs. Barlow sitting in a pew. "Looks like we have witnesses," Dawson murmured to Margaret as he helped her down from the wagon. "Will that be a problem?" She whispered back, anxiety evident in her voice. "No," Dawson assured her. "It's better this way, more official." The ceremony was brief but solemn. Reverend Miller spoke of duty and devotion, of the sacred bond between husband and wife. When the time came to exchange vows, Dawson was surprised by the emotion that welled up in his throat as he promised to love, honor, and protect Margaret and Grace. When he slid the simple gold band onto Margaret's finger, her hand trembled in his. Looking into her eyes as he spoke his vows, Dawson realized with startling clarity that he meant every word. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller declared. "You may kiss your bride." Dawson hesitated, aware of their audience. He and Margaret hadn't discussed this part. Gently, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a chaste but tender kiss. Despite its brevity, he felt something spark between them, a promise, a possibility. After the ceremony, Sheriff Barlow approached them, his wife at his side. "Congratulations to you both," Mrs. Barlow said warmly. "What a lovely little family you make." "Thank you, Mrs. Barlow," Margaret replied with a gracious smile, cradling Grace against her shoulder. The sheriff's gaze was more measured. "Congratulations, Dawson, Mrs. Reed." He glanced at Grace. "Beautiful child, how old is she?" 3 months, Margaret answered without hesitation. Sheriff Barlow nodded slowly. "Well, I wish you all happiness. I'll be sending a reply to that telegram from Denver. Let them know their missing woman isn't in our jurisdiction." Relief washed over Dawson. "I appreciate that, Tom." As they drove back to the ranch, now legally husband and wife, a comfortable silence settled between them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since he'd found her on those church steps, Dawson felt that Margaret might truly be safe. "Thank you," she said softly as the ranch came into view. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done." Dawson glanced at her, then at little Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "There's nothing to repay. We're family now, on paper at least, and family takes care of each other." The words felt right as he said them. Family. It had been so long since he'd had one of his own. The weeks following the wedding settled into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Margaret took over the running of the household, bringing order and warmth to spaces that had been merely functional before her arrival. She proved to be an excellent cook, and Dawson found himself looking forward to meals in a way he never had before. Frank became devoted to little Grace, fashioning toys for her from bits of wood, and spending his free time making her laugh with silly faces. The baby thrived under the attention, growing plumper and more alert each day. As for Dawson and Margaret, they navigated their unusual arrangement with careful respect for each other's boundaries. Dawson insisted Margaret take the main bedroom while he continued to sleep on a cot in his study. Though legally married, they were still essentially strangers learning to live together, yet Dawson found himself increasingly drawn to his new wife. He admired her resilience, her quick intelligence, the gentle way she spoke to Grace. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire after Grace was asleep, talking for hours about their lives, their dreams, their disappointments. "Did you ever think of having children of your own?" Margaret asked one night as they sat together, a chessboard between them. She had proven to be a formidable opponent, winning as many games as she lost. Dawson moved his knight, considering the question. "I suppose I did once, before the war, after." He shrugged. "I never met the right woman, and I wasn't going to marry just for the sake of having children." "And now you have a ready-made family," Margaret said, a hint of guilt in her voice as she captured his bishop. "A family I'm grateful for," Dawson assured her, meeting her eyes across the board. "Never doubt that, Margaret." A blush colored her cheeks as she looked away. "Check," she said softly, moving her queen. November brought the first snow, transforming the landscape into a white wonderland. Margaret stood at the window one morning, Grace in her arms, watching the flakes drift down. "It's beautiful," she breathed when Dawson joined her. "So peaceful." "It can also be dangerous," Dawson cautioned. "Winter in Colorado is no joke. We need to be prepared for being snowed in sometimes." Margaret turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, living so remotely?" Dawson considered this. "No," he said finally. "I needed this life, the space, the work, the quiet. It healed something in me that the war broke." He glanced at her. "Do you miss the city, the conveniences, the society?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted, "but there's a freedom here I never experienced in Boston or even Denver." "And Grace is thriving." She hesitated. "I feel safe here, Dawson, for the first time in a very long time." Their eyes met, and Dawson felt an overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms. Instead, he gently touched her shoulder. "You are safe, both of you." As winter deepened, the ranch became increasingly isolated. The road to town was often impassable, and visitors were rare. Dawson worried that Margaret might feel trapped or lonely, but she seemed to blossom in the quiet routine of ranch life. Christmas approached, and Margaret threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm. She baked cookies and pies, fashioned decorations from pine boughs and ribbon, and sewed new stockings for each of them, including a tiny one for Grace. On Christmas Eve, Frank joined them for dinner, bringing with him a rocking horse he had secretly crafted for Grace. Though she was still too small to use it, Margaret was moved to tears by the gift. "It's magnificent, Frank," she said, running her hand over the smooth wooden mane. "Grace will treasure it for years to come." "Just wanted the little miss to have something special," Frank said gruffly, embarrassed by her gratitude. After dinner, Frank departed for his cabin, leaving the small family alone. Dawson produced a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For you," he said, handing it to Margaret. "Merry Christmas." Margaret untied the string carefully and unwrapped the paper to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages. "A journal," Dawson explained. "I thought you might like to write down your thoughts or perhaps stories for Grace when she's older." Margaret ran her fingers over the soft leather cover. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." She reached beneath the tree and pulled out a package of her own. "And this is for you." Dawson unwrapped it to find a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this?" he asked, touched by the hours of work it represented. Margaret nodded. "I noticed your old one was rather worn. Do you like it?" "I love it," Dawson said sincerely, wrapping it around his neck. "It's the finest gift I've received in years." They sat together by the fire, Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby as snow fell softly outside. The moment felt precious to Dawson, perfect in its simplicity. "Are you happy here, Margaret?" he asked suddenly, needing to know. She looked at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Happier than I thought possible after everything that happened." Dawson reached for her hand and she let him take it. "I'm glad," he said softly. "Because I'm happier with you and Grace here than I've been in a very long time." Margaret's fingers tightened around his. "Even though our marriage is just an arrangement." "Is that all it is to you?" Dawson asked, his heart suddenly pounding. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "No," she admitted. "Not anymore." Dawson moved closer, releasing her hand to gently touch her cheek. "Margaret," he said softly, "I know we came together under unusual circumstances, but these past months have meant everything to me. You and Grace have brought life back to this ranch and to me." "Dawson," Margaret whispered, her eyes searching his. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Dawson leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike their wedding kiss, this one was neither brief nor chaste. Margaret's arms slid around his neck as she returned the kiss with a passion that surprised and delighted him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Reed," he confessed. Tears glistened in her eyes. "And I with you," she whispered. "I never expected this." "Nor did I," Dawson agreed, "but I'm grateful for it nonetheless." That night, for the first time, they shared the master bedroom as true husband and wife. Winter gave way to spring, bringing with it new life across the ranch. Calves were born, wildflowers bloomed, and Grace began to crawl, exploring her world with delighted determination. Margaret and Dawson's relationship deepened with each passing day, their initially practical arrangement blossoming into genuine love. One April morning, as Dawson and Frank were repairing fences in the north pasture, they spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Dawson shaded his eyes against the sun, recognizing Sheriff Barlow's tall figure. "Morning, Tom," Dawson called as the sheriff drew near. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Barlow dismounted, his expression serious. "Dawson, Frank, I need to speak with you about a private matter." Frank nodded and moved away to give them privacy, continuing his work on the fence. "What is it?" Dawson asked, tension creeping into his shoulders. "Got another telegram from Denver," the sheriff said. "Man named Douglas Patterson is still looking for his child. Claims the mother stole the baby and ran off. He's offering a substantial reward now." Dawson's jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with me?" "There are rumors, Dawson," Sheriff Barlow said quietly. "Talk about how suddenly you acquired a wife and child. The timing matches too well with this Patterson fellow's story." "My wife is Margaret Reed," Dawson said firmly. "We were married in your presence, Tom." "I know what I witnessed," the sheriff agreed, but I also know that sometimes things aren't what they appear to be." He sighed heavily. "Patterson is coming to Silverdale, Dawson. He's determined to search the entire region." Cold fear gripped Dawson's heart. When? End of the week, according to the telegram. Sheriff Barlow studied Dawson's face. "If there's anything you want to tell me, now would be the time." Dawson remained silent, mind racing through their options. The sheriff sighed again. "I thought as much. Look, Dawson, I've known you for years. You're a good man. Whatever your reasons, I trust you had them." He mounted his horse. "Consider this a friendly warning. Patterson is bringing legal papers and he's not coming alone." "Thank you, Tom," Dawson said quietly. After the sheriff rode away, Dawson called to Frank. "I need to get back to the house. Finish what you can hear." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be along shortly, boss." Dawson rode hard back to the ranch, fear and determination warring in his chest. When he burst through the door, Margaret looked up from where she was playing with Grace on a blanket by the fire, alarm crossing her face at his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, gathering Grace into her arms. Dawson knelt beside them, touching Grace's soft curls before meeting Margaret's eyes. "He's coming," he said simply. "Douglas Patterson. He'll be in Silverdale by the end of the week." The color drained from Margaret's face. "How did he find us?" "Persistence. Money. He's been sending telegrams all over Colorado." Dawson took her free hand in his. "Margaret, we need to decide what to do." "We could run," she suggested, desperation in her voice. "Go farther west or north to Wyoming territory." Dawson shook his head. "He'd just keep searching. And we'd always be looking over our shoulders." He squeezed her hand. "I think we need to stand our ground." "But he has money influence," Margaret protested. "What chance do we have against him?" "We have truth on our side," Dawson said firmly, "and we have this." He gestured to the three of them. "A real family, Margaret, not just on paper anymore." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "I'm so afraid, Dawson. What if he takes her from us?" "He won't," Dawson vowed. "I promise you that." He pulled her and Grace into his arms, holding them tightly. "Trust me, Margaret. We'll face this together." The next few days passed in tense preparation. Dawson rode into town to speak with Judge Wilson, the circuit judge who happened to be in Silverdale that week. Without revealing all the details, he explained that a man from Denver was coming to challenge his and Margaret's custody of Grace. "He claims to be the child's father," Dawson told the judge, "but he abandoned both mother and child before Grace was born. Now that Margaret and I are married, he has no legal claim." Judge Wilson, a stern but fair man in his 60s, nodded thoughtfully. "Bring your wife and child to my chambers on Friday morning. I'll hear both sides before this becomes a public spectacle." On Friday morning, Dawson and Margaret dressed in their best clothes and brought Grace, looking adorable in a new dress Margaret had made, to the judge's chambers in the small Silverdale courthouse. Frank accompanied them for moral support, waiting outside while they met with Judge Wilson. They had been there only a few minutes when the door opened, and Douglas Patterson entered, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit whom Dawson presumed was his lawyer. Margaret's hand tightened painfully around Dawson's as she faced the man who had once promised to love her, then abandoned her when she needed him most. Patterson was handsome in a polished way, his clothes expensive, his manner confident. His eyes hardened when he saw Margaret holding Grace. "There they are," he said coldly, "my daughter and the woman who stole her from me." "That's enough," Judge Wilson said sharply. "Everyone will have a chance to speak." He gestured to chairs arranged before his desk. "Please be seated." Once everyone was settled, the judge addressed Patterson. "Mr. Patterson, you claim that Mrs. Reed absconded with your child. What evidence do you have of paternity?" Patterson's lawyer stepped forward, presenting documents. "Your Honor, my client was in a relationship with the woman calling herself Margaret Reed, then known as Margaret Thornton, for several months in Denver. When she informed him of her pregnancy, he was preparing to formalize their arrangement, but she disappeared without warning, taking the child that rightfully belongs in my client's home." Dawson felt Margaret trembling beside him and placed a steadying hand on her back. "Mrs. Reed," the judge turned to Margaret, "what is your response to these allegations?" Margaret raised her chin, her voice surprisingly steady. Mr. Patterson and I were briefly involved in Denver. When I told him I was with child, he denied responsibility and threatened to ruin my reputation if I pursued support. I did not see him again until after Grace was born, when he approached me with his new wife and threatened to take my baby, claiming I was unfit because I was unmarried. Lies, Patterson snapped. I offered to provide for the child. It was Margaret who refused my assistance. Did you offer marriage? Judge Wilson asked sharply. Patterson hesitated. My circumstances at the time prevented, so you did not, the judge interrupted. Yet you claim paternal rights. My client has established a stable home with his wife, the lawyer interjected smoothly. They are prepared to raise the child with every advantage. And what of the mother's rights? Judge Wilson asked. The lawyer's expression hardened. Given the circumstances of the child's birth and Miss Thornton's flight, we contend that maternal rights should be secondary to the child's welfare. Dawson could remain silent no longer. Your Honor, if I may speak, the judge nodded. Go ahead, Mr. Reed. Margaret and I are legally married. I have accepted Grace as my daughter in every way that matters. We have a stable home, a prosperous ranch. Grace is thriving in our care. Dawson looked directly at Patterson. A father isn't made by blood alone, but by love, responsibility, and presence. Mr. Patterson denied his child before she was born. I have embraced her from the moment I found Margaret feeding her on the steps of an abandoned church. Patterson's face flushed with anger. You have no right, I have every right, Dawson interrupted firmly. I am Grace's father now, by law and by choice. Judge Wilson held up a hand to prevent further argument. I've heard enough for now. He studied each face carefully. This is not a simple matter. While I consider my decision, I would like to observe the child with both parties. He instructed Margaret to hand Grace to Patterson. The moment Grace left her mother's arms, she began to cry, her little face crumpling in distress. Patterson held her awkwardly, bouncing her in a way that only increased her discomfort. After a painful minute, the judge asked Patterson to return Grace to Margaret. The instant she was back in her mother's embrace, Grace quieted, her small hand clutching Margaret's dress as she hiccuped softly. Judge Wilson watched this exchange thoughtfully, then asked to see Grace with Dawson. Margaret passed the baby to her husband, and Dawson cradled her gently against his chest, murmuring soothing words. Grace relaxed in his arms, her eyes so like her mother's gazing trustingly up at him. I see, the judge said simply. He sat back in his chair, considering for several long moments before speaking again. Mr. Patterson, while I don't dismiss your claim of paternity, your actions do not demonstrate the commitment of a father. You abandoned Miss Thornton during her pregnancy and made no effort to support her or the child until recently. He turned to Margaret and Dawson. The Reeds have established a stable and loving home for Grace. The child is clearly bonded to both of them. Patterson's lawyer began to protest, but Judge Wilson silenced him with a raised hand. My decision is this. Custody of Grace will remain with Margaret and Dawson Reed. Mr. Patterson, if you wish to pursue visitation rights, you may petition the court separately, but I will not separate this child from the only parents she has known. Relief washed over Dawson so powerfully that he felt light-headed. Beside him, Margaret began to cry softly, clutching his arm. Patterson stood, fury evident in every line of his body. This isn't over, he said coldly. I have friends in the territorial government. I'll appeal this decision. That is your right, Judge Wilson said calmly. But I suggest you consider carefully whether pursuing this matter is truly in the child's best interest or merely your own pride. He nodded to Dawson and Margaret. You may go, Mr. and Mrs. Reed. Take your daughter home. Outside the courthouse, Frank was waiting anxiously. When he saw their faces, he broke into a broad grin. Good news, the best, Dawson confirmed, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. Grace stays with us. We're officially a family. As they walked toward their wagon, Dawson spotted Patterson and his lawyer leaving the courthouse, heading toward the hotel. The man's eyes burned with resentment as he watched them, and Dawson felt a flicker of unease. Patterson wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Do you think he'll really appeal? Margaret asked quietly as they drove home, echoing his thoughts. He might try, Dawson acknowledged. But appeals take time, and with each passing day, our case grows stronger. Grace is ours, Margaret, legally and in every way that matters. That night after Grace was asleep, Dawson and Margaret sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Margaret rested her head on Dawson's shoulder, their hands entwined. "I was so afraid today," she confessed. "When I saw him again, all the fear came rushing back." "You were incredibly brave," Dawson told her. "I'm so proud of you." Margaret lifted her head to look at him. "What you said in there about being Grace's father by choice, that was beautiful, Dawson. It's the truth," he said simply. "I may not have helped create her, but I love her as if I had, just as I love you." "I love you too," Margaret whispered. "So much that sometimes it frightens me." Dawson brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Why does it frighten you?" "Because I never expected to find this kind of happiness after everything that happened. It feels almost too perfect, too precious." She took a shaky breath. "What if we lose it?" "We won't," Dawson promised, pulling her close. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what families do." As spring gave way to summer, life at Willow Creek Ranch settled into a joyful routine. Grace took her first steps in July, toddling unsteadily from Margaret to Dawson, her face alight with triumph. The moment brought tears to both their eyes. Patterson made good on his threat to appeal, but as Judge Wilson had predicted, the process was slow, and the territorial court seemed in no hurry to overturn a decision that clearly served the child's best interests. As months passed with no further developments, the shadow over their happiness gradually lifted. In August, Margaret shared news that brought Dawson immeasurable joy. She was expecting their child. The baby would arrive in early spring, making Grace a big sister before her first birthday. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked anxiously after telling him, her hands protectively covering her still flat stomach. Dawson gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said, laughing as he set her down gently. "I never dared hope for such a blessing." As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, Dawson found himself falling even more deeply in love with his wife. The sight of her nurturing new life within her while caring so tenderly for Grace filled him with wonder and gratitude. In October, on the anniversary of the day he found her at the abandoned church, Dawson took Margaret back to that spot. The old building looked much the same, weathered and lonely against the autumn sky. "Why did you bring me here?" Margaret asked, puzzled. Dawson took her hands in his. "Because 1 year ago today, my life changed forever on these steps. I found a woman feeding a baby, both of them alone and afraid. I offered my name without fear, never imagining how completely you would capture my heart." He kissed her gently. "I wanted to thank you, Margaret, for trusting me that day. For taking a chance on a lonely rancher who didn't know how empty his life was until you filled it." Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears. "I'm the one who should be thankful. You saved us, Dawson." "No," he corrected softly. "We saved each other." As they stood together on those weathered church steps, the place where their journey began, Dawson marveled at the twists of fate that had brought them together. A desperate woman, a crying baby, an abandoned church, and a cowboy riding past at just the right moment. Coincidence or destiny? The result was the same. A family forged not by blood but by choice, by love, by the courage to offer shelter when it was needed most. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, but Dawson felt no concern. Whatever weather approached, they would weather it together, safe in the home they had built with love. Winter returned to Colorado, blanketing Willow Creek Ranch in pristine white. Inside the warm house, Margaret's belly grew round with new life while Grace, now a curious toddler, explored her world with boundless enthusiasm. The family prepared for Christmas again, their second as a family, with joyful anticipation. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, Dawson sat with Margaret before the fire, Grace asleep in her new bed upstairs. His hand rested on Margaret's stomach, feeling the strong kicks of their unborn child. "What a difference a year makes," Margaret mused, covering his hand with hers. "Last Christmas, I was still afraid that our happiness couldn't last. And now," Dawson asked, kissing her temple. Margaret smiled, contentment radiating from her. "Now I know that some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem at first." She turned to face him fully. I received a letter today from my father's solicitor in Boston. Dawson raised his eyebrows in surprise. What did it say? My father passed away last month, Margaret said, her voice steady. Despite disowning me, he left me a portion of his estate. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to ensure Grace will have opportunities when she's older. I'm sorry about your father, Dawson said gently. Margaret nodded, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I wish he could have known Grace and you. He might have understood then that true worth isn't measured by social standing or wealth, but by the capacity to love. Dawson pulled her closer, mindful of her delicate condition. Your father's loss our gain, he said softly, but I'm glad he did right by you in the end. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace until Margaret spoke again. I heard from Sheriff Barlow yesterday when I was in town. Douglas Patterson has withdrawn his appeal. Dawson straightened in surprise. Why? Apparently his wife is expecting a child of their own, Margaret explained. Perhaps that changed his perspective. Whatever the reason, Grace is truly ours now without any shadow hanging over us. Relief and joy surged through Dawson. That's the best Christmas gift we could receive. Almost the best, Margaret corrected with a smile, placing his hand on her rounded belly just as the baby delivered a particularly energetic kick. As the fire crackled and snow continued to fall outside, Dawson thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. From a chance encounter at an abandoned church to a marriage of convenience that had blossomed into the deepest love he'd ever known, every step, even the painful ones, had led them here. I love you, Margaret Reed, he whispered against her hair. And I love you, Dawson Reed, she replied, turning her face up for his kiss. Now and always. In February 1878, as winter's grip on Colorado began to loosen, Margaret gave birth to a healthy boy they named Daniel James Reed. Grace, not quite 16 months old, regarded her new brother with a mixture of curiosity and proprietary pride, insisting on helping Margaret with every aspect of the baby's care. As Dawson watched his wife nursing their son while Grace chattered beside them, he felt a sense of completion he had never imagined possible. From the solitary, haunted man he had been after the war to this, a husband, a father, the head of a family bound by love rather than obligation, the transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, painting the ranch with wildflowers and fresh green growth. On a warm April morning, Dawson took Grace on her first pony ride, her delighted laughter carrying across the pasture to where Margaret sat on the porch with baby Daniel. She's fearless, Margaret observed as Dawson led the gentle pony back toward the house, Grace bouncing excitedly on its back. Like her mother, Dawson replied with a grin. Margaret smiled, adjusting Daniel against her shoulder. I wasn't always brave. I was terrified that day you found me at the church. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Dawson said, lifting Grace from the pony. It's acting despite it. You've always been the bravest person I know, Margaret. Grace wiggled free from his arms and ran to her mother. Mama, I rode a pony. I saw, my darling, Margaret said, hugging her with one arm while still cradling Daniel. You were very brave. Like Papa, Grace declared confidently, looking up at Dawson with adoring eyes. Later that night, after both children were asleep, Dawson and Margaret sat on their porch swing, a tradition they had maintained through seasons of joy and challenge. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Colorado sky. Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out? Margaret asked, her head resting comfortably on Dawson's shoulder. If you hadn't ridden past that church at that exact moment, Dawson considered this. I've thought about it, he admitted. But I prefer to believe it wasn't chance, that somehow we were meant to find each other. Margaret smiled against his shoulder. The cowboy and the runaway mother, the lost souls who found home in each other, Dawson corrected gently. As the swing rocked slowly in the cool night air, Dawson reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. A moment of compassion, an offer made without expectation, a name given freely, these simple acts had created the foundation for a love that now defined his existence. Whatever the future held for the Reed family, Dawson knew with absolute certainty that they would face it together, drawing strength from the bond that had been forged that fateful day at an abandoned church, when a cowboy found a woman feeding her baby and offered his name without fear.